She never expected gratitude, and she certainly never expected answers, because for most of her life she had learned to live with unanswered questions, quietly raising a child that was never biologically hers, but emotionally became her entire world, stepping into the role not out of obligation, but out of necessity when the real mother disappeared without explanation. And for years, she told herself that love did not require explanations or blood ties, only presence, patience, and consistency. Yet, as the child grew older and began asking innocent questions about the past, about names, photographs, and silences that felt too heavy to be accidental, something inside her began to shift, because she realized that protecting the truth had slowly turned into hiding from it. And when a single document surfaced during an ordinary paperwork review, a name, a date, a connection she was never meant to see, the story she had lived by for decades cracked open, forcing her to confront not only the child's origins, but her own quiet sacrifices, the years she gave without recognition, and the unspoken agreement she had made with herself to never ask for more. And as she sat alone that night, replaying every memory through this new lens, she understood that love had never been the mistake. Silence was, and whatever came next would require courage she had postponed for far too long. The following days passed with a strange heaviness, not dramatic or loud, but dense, like air before a storm. Because once the truth entered her awareness, it refused to stay quiet, weaving itself into every routine moment. Cooking dinner, folding laundry, listening to the child laugh in the next room, and she began to notice how carefully she had built her life around avoiding questions that now demanded answers, remembering how she had once promised herself that love would be enough, that explanation was optional. Yet the older the child became, the clearer it was that love without honesty slowly turns into confusion. And one evening, while watching him study old family photos spread across the table, she felt a sharp realization settle in. The truth was no longer just hers to carry, because the past she had protected was now shaping someone else's future, and the weight of that responsibility pressed harder than any fear she had ever known, forcing her to accept that silence, no matter how well-intentioned, had quietly rewritten a story that did not belong to her alone. And if she continued pretending otherwise, the eventual reckoning would hurt far more than the honesty she had delayed for so long. That night, she barely slept, not because of fear or panic, but because her mind kept circling the same realization from different angles, replaying moments she had once dismissed as insignificant, a pause in his answers, a story that changed slightly over the years, the way certain questions were always redirected. And she understood now that none of it had been accidental, that what she once called protecting the peace had actually been a slow agreement to live inside a carefully edited version of her own life. And as the hours passed, she began to feel something unfamiliar growing beneath the exhaustion. Not anger, but clarity, the kind that doesn't shout but quietly rearranges everything. Because for the first time, she stopped asking why he had hidden the truth and started asking why she had accepted not knowing it, realizing how often she had chosen comfort over certainty, harmony over honesty, telling herself that digging deeper would only create damage, when in reality, the damage had already been happening quietly, invisibly, year after year. And by the time morning light filled the room, she knew that whatever came next would change more than a conversation. It would change the way she understood her past, her choices, and the silent role she had played in maintaining a story that was never fully real. The next day unfolded with an unsettling sense of normalcy, as if the world had not received the message that something fundamental inside her had shifted, and she moved through familiar routines almost mechanically, answering questions, completing tasks, smiling when expected. Yet internally, she was measuring every interaction against a new awareness, noticing how often she had learned to shrink her doubts to keep things running smoothly, how many times she had accepted partial truths simply because they arrived wrapped in reassurance. And as she replayed past conversations, she began to recognize the pattern. The moments where her intuition had quietly spoken up, only to be gently overridden by his confidence, his certainty, his calm explanations that always sounded reasonable enough to silence discomfort. And it became clear that the issue had never been a single lie or a single moment of betrayal, but a long-standing imbalance where clarity was treated as optional and her need for it as inconvenient. And this realization did not arrive with dramatic emotion, but with a steady heaviness, because she understood that confronting him would not be about extracting answers anymore. It would be about reclaiming the authority she had slowly handed away. And by the time evening arrived, she no longer felt confused about what needed to be said, only aware that once spoken, there would be no way to return to the version of their life that depended on silence to survive. That night, lying awake beside him, she became acutely aware of the quiet space between their breaths, the subtle distance that had nothing to do with physical closeness and everything to do with what remained unspoken. And as she stared into the darkness, she realized how often she had mistaken peace for the absence of conflict. How many nights like this she had spent convincing herself that silence meant stability, when in reality it was simply postponement. And the thought unsettled her, because she could no longer ignore how exhausting it had been to constantly manage her own expectations, to lower the volume of her doubts so the relationship could remain intact. And while he slept peacefully beside her, she understood that love should not require this level of self-erasure, that trust was not meant to feel like something she had to actively maintain through restraint. And as the hours passed, she did not rehearse accusations or arguments. She simply acknowledged a quiet truth she had avoided for years, that whatever conversation awaited them would not be about blame or proof, but about whether honesty still had a place between them. And if it did not, then staying would cost her more than leaving ever could. The following day unfolded with a strange heaviness that clung to her from morning until evening, as if her body had already accepted a truth her mind was still circling around. And while she went through familiar routines, making coffee, answering messages, nodding at conversations she barely registered, she felt an increasing awareness of how performative her life had become, how often she played the role of a woman who was content simply because it was easier than confronting what had been slowly eroding beneath the surface. And as she replayed years of shared moments in her head, the anniversaries, the quiet dinners, the promises made casually and broken quietly, she recognized a pattern she had once dismissed as coincidence, realizing now that her instincts had been warning her long before evidence ever appeared. And this realization did not arrive with anger or hysteria, but with an almost clinical clarity that frightened her more than pain would have, because clarity left no room for denial. And when she finally sat alone that evening, phone resting untouched beside her, she did not search for confirmation or reassurance. She did not need it anymore. Instead, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what it meant to outgrow a version of love that required constant self-negotiation. And in that stillness, she understood that the most devastating betrayal had not been a single act or secret, but the slow normalization of doubt, the way she had been taught by habit, by fear, by loyalty to doubt herself first. And as that understanding settled, she felt something shift inside her, not relief yet, but resolve, the quiet beginning of a decision that would change the trajectory of her life, whether he ever understood it or not. When the conversation finally began, it did not start with confrontation or raised voices, but with a calm question spoken almost too softly, the kind that carries weight not because of its volume, but because of its inevitability. And as she watched his reaction unfold in real time, the pause, the forced smile, the instinctive deflection, she recognized the choreography immediately, a dance she had unknowingly participated in for years. And in that moment, she felt oddly detached, observing rather than engaging, realizing how much emotional labor she had invested into protecting him from discomfort while absorbing her own in silence. And as he spoke in fragments, explanations layered with half-truths and carefully chosen omissions, she understood that the conversation was no longer about extracting honesty from him, but about acknowledging it within herself, because the truth did not need to be confessed to exist. And while he talked, she felt an unfamiliar steadiness take hold, a sense that she was no longer pleading to be chosen or understood, but simply listening to confirm what she already knew. And when the silence finally returned, she did not rush to fill it, allowing it to stretch and settle between them, aware that this silence was different from the ones before. This one was not avoidance, but conclusion. And as she stood to leave the room, she realized that some endings do not announce themselves with drama. They arrive quietly, carried by clarity, leaving behind a space where fear once lived. Later that evening, alone with the quiet she had been avoiding for so long, she noticed how different solitude felt when it was no longer imposed but chosen. And as the house settled into stillness, she moved through familiar rooms with a new awareness, seeing not just furniture and memories, but the invisible compromises she had made in each corner. The laughter she had softened, the questions she had swallowed, the instincts she had postponed in the name of keeping things intact. And instead of sadness, she felt a slow, deliberate grief, not for what had ended, but for how long she had waited to trust herself. And as she sat by the window watching the city lights blur into the dark, she realized that healing would not arrive as a sudden release, but as a series of small, unglamorous decisions, moments where she would choose clarity over comfort, self-respect over familiarity. And while uncertainty stretched ahead of her, she did not feel lost, because for the first time in years, her direction was not defined by his presence or absence, but by the quiet certainty that whatever came next would be built on truth rather than tolerance. In the days that followed, she began to notice changes, not in him, but in herself. Subtle at first, yet impossible to ignore. As if a lens had been quietly adjusted and everything now appeared sharper, more honest. And while daily life continued with its usual rhythm, she felt increasingly detached from the version of herself that had once accepted confusion as normal, and moments that used to pass without question now lingered in her mind, forcing reflection, forcing acknowledgement. And as she revisited past conversations, she recognized how often clarity had been offered and dismissed simply because accepting it would have required action. And this realization did not come with self-blame, but with an aching compassion for the woman she had been, someone who loved deeply yet feared disruption more than disappointment. And as she moved through her days, she no longer searched his face for reassurance or meaning. Instead, she listened to her own reactions, her silences, her discomfort, understanding now that intuition was not an enemy to be subdued, but a signal she had ignored for far too long. And in this quiet recalibration, she felt both exposed and grounded, because growth did not arrive as empowerment slogans or dramatic declarations. It arrived as discomfort paired with honesty. And while the future remained unresolved, she sensed with a certainty that startled her that whatever path lay ahead would be shaped by awareness rather than avoidance, and that alone made the uncertainty bearable. On the morning she finally chose to move forward, there was no dramatic clarity or sudden sense of victory, only a quiet steadiness that surprised her. And as she prepared for the day, she noticed how light the air felt without the weight of unanswered questions pressing against her chest. And while the past still existed, intact and unchangeable, it no longer demanded her constant negotiation or reinterpretation because she had stopped asking it to be different. And as she stepped outside, she understood that healing would not erase what had happened or soften every memory, but it would allow those memories to coexist with new beginnings without defining them. And for the first time in years, she felt aligned with her own choices, not rushing toward happiness or away from pain, but walking deliberately into a future shaped by honesty, self-respect, and the quiet courage it took to finally listen to herself.